It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Obogu. Dr. Obogu is a professor and the Associate Dean of Research in the Faculty of Law. He's a member of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists and Scientists, the Cates Group Chair in Health Law in the University of Alberta, and the Chair of the University of Alberta Research Ethics Board. Dr. Obogu is a recipient of the Confederation of Alberta Faculty Association's Distinguished Academic Early Career Award. He holds a doctorate in law from the University of Toronto, a master's degree from the University of Alberta, and undergraduate degrees in law from the University of Benin, Nigeria, and the Nigerian Law School. Dr. Obogu's scholarly work is focused broadly on the ethical, legal, and societal implications of novel and emerging biotechnologies and associated research. His publications have explored a diverse range of issues in this field, including the ethical and legal issues associated with stem cell research, gene and engineered cell therapies, biobanks, germline gene editing, and assisted reproductive technologies. As a multidisciplinary scholar, his teaching and research activities explore and cut across various fields, including health law, bioethics, science policy, science and technology studies, public health, legal history, and legal philosophy. He has led or been involved in many prominent national and international biotechnology policymaking activities and writes and comments frequently in the popular press on matters related to the impacts of biotechnology in science and society. Dr. Obogu has served on numerous boards and councils, including the Health Quality Council of Alberta, the Council of Canadian Academy's Expert Panel on Somatic Gene and Engineered Cell Therapies, the Council of Canadian Academy's Expert Panel on Medical Assistance in Dying, the CIHR Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, the CIHR Governing Council Standing Committee on Ethics, and the International Society for Stem Cell Research Task Force on Guidelines for Stem Cell Research and Clinical Translation. Without further ado, I pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Michael. I should have sent you a shorter bio, so I apologize, but I have to subject everyone to that very long introduction and long bio. But thank you for the generous introduction. It is my pleasure to present this seminar to you today. I've always wanted to present a Dossiter Center seminar, and I'm glad for the opportunity. And I want to thank you and Carol for making this possible. Today, I'll be talking to you about the topic that's shown on the slide, on the title slide. It's based on a paper that I've also shared, which I hope everyone gets to read, because the paper really fleshes out in much more detail the points that I'm going to speak to you about in about 30 minutes or so. And I'm going to keep my remarks hopefully short. That and academics tend to promise that and then go on for very long. But hopefully I can keep my comments fairly brief, and so that I can allow for time for us to have a discussion and a Q&A. So the topic is pandemic necropolitics, vulnerability, resilience, and the crisis of marginalization in the liberal democratic state. This is a paper that is a reflection on the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but in many ways, a reflection on pandemic and epidemic events generally, and on the effects that happen to people, certain groups of people, when we have pandemic or epidemic events. It is a paper about how we as a society react to pandemic and epidemic events, and about how governments in particular react through law and policy, but also, more importantly, about certain frames of thinking that members of society adopt when we have a health crisis such as the pandemic, and how these frames of thinking then turn into tropes, which people use as ways to live through and react to the pandemic, which I think are quite problematic and need to be called out in many ways so that we can become aware of it and we can avoid them, but also that we don't make the mistake of having those tropes translate into policy. Because from a standpoint of policy and public health policy, I think they are quite dangerous. And lastly, it's a paper about marginalization and what it means to be among the marginalized in the context of a pandemic in a liberal democratic state, like ours. So Canada is a liberal democracy, and in countries that style themselves as liberal democracies, what it means to be among the marginalized, and why I think that health crisis like this is really a crisis of marginalization. What I mean by that is that pandemic events and health crises like this tend to affect people who are marginalized already. The most severe impacts are usually experienced by those who are marginalized. And ultimately, while we can say that the pandemic has had, an effect on all of us, it is the marginalized who tend to have the most effect, and the ones who tend to have the least protection from society, and who tend to have the least protection from the kinds of policies that we enact in response to pandemic events. So that's what the paper is about in a nutshell. It's a very theoretical paper that I wrote a while ago because I was responding to a request by two scholars in Europe who were putting together a book on vulnerabilities in the post-pandemic state, and they invited me to reflect on the idea of vulnerability and the idea of a post-pandemic state. And this was my response to that call. And it's a very theoretical paper. And what I'm going to try and do is explain my thinking and the theories that I rely on to write in writing the paper. And hopefully we can have a discussion about the various ways I've approached my thinking in this paper. So here's a roadmap for how I'm going to proceed with the talk. So first, I'm going to define what I mean by necropolitics to situate the main theoretical idea that I rely on in this paper. Then I'm going to talk about vulnerability in the context of the pandemic and this crisis of marginalization that I've just spoken about. And I'm going to use a few stories to illustrate how the pandemic has had a very significant impact on those who are marginalized and the ways in which the pandemic has deepened marginalization and vulnerability in our society. That story is going to continue by, through examples I'll give about how people who are marginalized, like the homeless, the immune compromised, and the severely disabled, have basically been left behind or have had their situations made worse by the pandemic and by the policies that were enacted to respond to the pandemic. I will then talk about a claim that people make about how the pandemic changed what was normal for us and has now created an abnormal state. Often you hear people talking about how we want to return to normal and about how the pandemic, which suggests that pandemic is an abnormal thing, and that what happened before, what was there before the pandemic, was a normal state. I'm going to problematize this concept and really take it to task. What I'm going to argue is that the pandemic, yes, may be an abnormal state, but that we didn't really have a normal state prior to the pandemic, especially for those who are marginalized. And that the only people who see the pandemic as an abnormal state compared to what was normal before are those who tend to be privileged and who do not experience life in the way that those who are marginalized experienced it. For those who are marginalized, there really is no normal state. That's what I'm going to argue, that what they have is a default abnormal state. Their lives by default exist in an abnormal state. And when you have a health crisis like a pandemic, what then happens is that there's an escalation of that default abnormal state to more abnormality. For them, they are not returning to a post-pandemic state. They are not returning to normalcy. They're instead going to return to something that is also abnormal. So it's a state where they're essentially doomed to abnormality. I use the term the nocturnal phase to talk about the policy response or the governmental response to this default abnormal state. And what I'm going to try and describe with this is how governments will enact policies that on its face seem to represent what would come across as a sensible, sometimes sensible way of dealing with the pandemic, but really what it masks or hides is policies that tend to deepen these very terrible impacts for those who are marginalized. And so what the state has is a nocturnal face in the sense that outwardly, it seems to be presenting itself as wanting to help, but behind that outward face, it operates in the dark, and it has this nocturnal disposition to making life worse for those who are marginalized. And then I'm going to attack again some concepts, what I refer to in my introduction as tropes of reasoning. And one that I'm going to focus on in particular for this talk is the idea of resilience, which is something you hear people talk about as well, that those who are marginalized, even though they are suffering these effects, tend to be resilient and that they have resilience. And I'm going to take this concept to task because I think it's a trope that allows us not to confront the fact that they're not necessarily being resilient, and that what is happening instead is that they are just suffering. And so resilience is our way, those of us who are privileged, is our way of coping, because we want to be able to explain what is happening to them in a way that results to a positive, instead of just admitting that these are people who are doomed. They were doomed before the pandemic. They remain doomed during the pandemic. And if we get to a post-pandemic state, they will continue to be doomed. And what we take to be resilience is really just their suffering. And so what I'm going to urge is that we actually get away from these tropes, things like hope, things like resilience, and instead focus on the problem, which is the state that has designed a situation where these people are doomed, endlessly doomed. Now, when the first time I gave this talk, people challenged me to come up with an answer for how we resolve this crisis of marginalization and how we look to solutions. I'm not very good at coming up with solutions. I know how to identify problems, but I took the challenge seriously, and I am going to offer the concept of practical justice as a possible panacea for how we get out of this necropolitics and the situation where people who are marginalized seem to be endlessly doomed by the situation we've created around public health in a liberal democratic state. Okay, let's get into it. So necropolitics is a term that was coined by a philosopher and political theorist called Achille Mbembe in a book that he wrote called Necropolitics. And this book, in this book, he developed some ideas that he had written about earlier in an article by the same title. I really urge you, if you have the time to read the book, it's one of my favorite works of political theory. And in this work, Achille Mbembe addresses this idea of necropolitics, by which he means the politics of death. He defines it as the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. He argues that many modern states, particularly modern states that are built on a colonial framework, what they do is essentially govern in this manner by holding on to themselves the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die, and using this power as a way to organize the state, formulate policy, and govern. He argues that within a necropolitical state, these necropoliticians essentially have decided who must live and who must die. And those who must die are in a permanent state of being considered to be so. And that you can view many of the policies that the states adopt as having this effect of ensuring that those who must die end up dying, and that there's really no way around it, that this is the way the states are organized, and that those who control the states in many ways covertly and overtly facilitate these states of necropolitics. So they come up with policies that assume or desire the inevitability of death for some people. And those people are usually those who are unseen, who are ordered, who are marginalized in society. And for them, life, even though they may exist and still alive, life is merely death's medium. He calls them the living dead because these policies make them so. They are essentially people who may be alive but who are just waiting to die, because state policy does one of two things, or two things. The first is state policy actually helps to achieve their death ultimately, or state policy has nothing to say about this state of being living dead. It doesn't protect them from it. And so they're just waiting to die. It's a very jarring claim, which is why I urge you to read the book. But it's one that as I've argued in this paper, is realized and was realized in the pandemic through the way that governments in Canada and across Canada reacted to the pandemic. So in the context of public health, I define this as public health being seen as public debt. This is when you turn public health, which is supposed to be a concept about how we achieve states of health and well-being in a population, and you turn it instead into public death, either by giving up on protecting people from the effects that bring about their death, or actually enacting policies that help achieve that death. So these are policies that are aimed at killing off those whose nature is deemed to contain what is already dead. And for many of us who are privileged, we will not recognize this as being true of us, because we're able to protect ourselves even from state policies. So if you take me, for example, my status is not one that can be defined in these terms, because when the pandemic started, it threw a lot of things at us, but because I have the means to, I've been able to protect myself from those effects. And even when the government pulled back from protections, I was able to achieve those protections on my own. If you just take my office, for example, in my office, I have an air purifier. I also have a humidifier right there. I have something that monitors in my office. I'm able to buy masks. I have them all the time. I'm able to protect myself. I have good healthcare coverage. I have all the kinds of things that protect me from being in this state. But for those who are marginalized, they are really just waiting to die. There's nothing of the sort that I have to protect me, that protects them. And when state policy renders them further victimized, and then all they're doing is just waiting to die. So Mbembe talked about this as a world without relations, where the individual and the political surpass and suppress the communal. It is a world where the individuals with means and those who control the political sphere do not think of a community of persons. It is a very sort of stratified and hierarchical society. It is individualized. So if you're somebody who's privileged, you may benefit from the individualization of society. If you're somebody who's not and who's marginalized, then you're individualized in a negative and bad way, because you're not part of a community that cares about you. The political doesn't think of you as a community, as part of a community. Everything is so individualized that everyone is on their own, essentially. You recognize this right away in that phrase that became very popular during the pandemic, of personal responsibility. You know, they talk about personal responsibility and about how we can get through the pandemic by, you know, taking personal responsibility for the effects of the pandemic. And that is essentially where we are right now. It's every person for themselves. And in that kind of situation, we have a world without relations where the individual and the political suppress and surpass the communal. So this is the key quote from Mbembe that sort of captures this idea of necropolitics. So sovereignty, he argues, consists in the power to manufacture. If you see me leaning and doing this, because I have, my camera is right in front of my screen. So I have to peer around it to read. So sovereignty consists in the power to manufacture an entire crowd of people who specifically live on the edge of life or even on its outer edge. People for whom living means continually standing up to death, and doing so under conditions in which death itself increasingly tends to become spectral. As a rule, such death is something to which nobody feels any obligation to respond. I want to read that again. As a rule, such death is something to which nobody feels any obligation to respond. Necropolitical power proceeds by a sort of inversion between life and death, as if life was merely death's medium. This is a very striking quote. In fact, if I stop the talk here, I'm sure if you sat back and reflected on this quote, I'm sure you know someone who is in this state, someone to which nobody feels any obligation, for someone who's dead to which nobody feels any obligation to respond. And that person is likely to be someone who we will classify as being marginalized in our society. Now, here's a quote. This is not from Mbembe, this is from Jason Kenney. That is a representation of the necropolitical idea. This was a quote that Jason Kenney offered on the floor of the legislature when he was Premier of Alberta. It captures in many ways, this idea of necropolitics. I think that Jason Kenney, as I argued in this paper, is a necropolitician. Is in the context of public health, he represents really one of the leading necropoliticians of our time. And you recall this quote where he talked about, this was very early in the pandemic, where he talked about the fact that we cannot continue indefinitely to impair the social and the economic. So again, think about this world without relations. He's trying to individuate and individualize the world. He's trying to separate the political from the communal. He's trying to separate the social and the economic from the communal. So we cannot continue indefinitely to impair the social and the economic, as well as the mental health and the physiological health of the broader population for potentially a year for an influenza that does not generally threaten life, apart from the elderly and the immune compromised. Just imagine that. The elderly and the immune compromised are not in his political calculation. For him, we can individuate these people, we can separate them from the communal, because our lives are not threatened except for the lives of those people. The lives of these categories of people are threatened, but our lives are not threatened. And so we can ignore them. It talks about how the average age of death from COVID in Alberta is 82. And I remind the House that the average life expectancy is 82. So for him, if you're 83 and older, or if you're immune compromised, you are already dead. You may be living, but you're already dead. And his political calculation doesn't include you. We can reopen the economy, we can let disease run rampant in our society. And if you die, so be it. You've lived enough. I mean, 82 is the life expectancy. You've lived enough. And so you're just living dead. So this is a perfect example of necropolitics, and I talk about it more in the paper. And this idea that's captured in Jason Kenney's quote is actually one that is evident if you look at case law cases, so legal cases that were filed against the government for failing to protect people during the pandemic or for all kinds of reasons. In some cases related to the pandemic. And I invite you to go to this website. It's a database that is freely available on the internet that contains all case law filed by various kinds of people during the pandemic. And if you look into this database, which is called the COVID-19 Litigation Open Access Case Law Database, what you'll find is all manner of cases including those filed by those who are considered vulnerable and marginalized, where they're making claims against government for failing to protect them or for actually removing protections that existed prior to the pandemic, essentially dooming them in ways that assure their death or serious harm coming to them. And the government doing so for the same reasons that Jason Kenney cited in that quote. And this database is really good because you can search by the cases by vulnerable groups that filed cases against the government, and you come up with like children, lots of cases by children or filed on behalf of children, the elderly, asylum seekers, persons with disabilities, persons with chronic diseases, all kinds of vulnerable groups. And this is quite amazing that, in the context of a pandemic, people who have the least means, who are also considered marginalized and vulnerable, are the ones who are bringing legal claims to vindicate their rights, to try and get some protection from governments for all kinds of effects. This to me is very, very striking. And many of these cases are being brought on their behalf by public interest litigators, so by lawyers who do this out of, the goodness of their hearts, who are not supported financially to do this, bringing all of these claims for all kinds of reasons. I encourage you to read this, and you'll see similar kinds of stories to the one that I just shared with you in relation to Jason Kenney. Anyway, that's just a graphic that shows you the distribution of vulnerable groups who are filing cases. But let's talk about some stories that illustrate the kinds of things that happen to people who are vulnerable or marginalized during the pandemic. So you may have heard of this story involving a man who froze to death on the steps of a Montreal shelter. This was sometime in January 2021. And he just froze to death. It was a homeless, houseless person who froze to death on the steps of the Montreal shelter. And the first question that comes to mind is, we know that people who are homeless are living in an abnormal state normally, routinely, right? We can never talk about normalcy for them. There's no pre-pandemic, pandemic or post-pandemic state. It's always abnormal for them because they don't have homes. And you then ask, why is it that in the pandemic, nobody thought that maybe we should do something about making sure that we address this problem? But in the pandemic, their lives actually got worse for all kinds of reasons. But in this particular situation, this was in the winter, and this person froze to death. And the reason he froze to death was because the city of Montreal had enacted a curfew, which said that, nobody was allowed to be on the streets after a certain time of the day. And this curfew was enacted by the Premier of Quebec without thinking, okay, some people actually live on the streets. And this was a curfew that was supposedly well-intentioned. The idea was, people should get off the streets because that's our way of sort of controlling the pandemic and controlling the spread of COVID-19. But at no point did he think, is this policy one that actually allows everyone to live their best lives, or that inconveniences everyone the same, or allows us to be able to sort of protect everyone in the same way. And even after this man died, he was urged, they said to him, look, people who are homeless need to be on the streets. When you make a curfew and you then police them off the streets, that forces them into situations where that deepen their vulnerability, that may put them in danger. Please make an exception. And he simply refused to do that. So what has happened in the pandemic is that for people who are homeless, who are in an abnormal state, these kinds of policies escalate the abnormality. It's not just about being homeless, it's about not being policed, about not being subject to effects, where even the places that they've taken temporary shelter, or which they even consider to be home, are no longer available to them, which then forces them into more vulnerability and more marginalization, and creates situations where that could lead to their death. he refused to. And so some groups that, again, who work for the interest of those who are in this kind of situation, brought a lawsuit, which I talk about in the paper, where they asked the judge to rule that a curfew does not apply to homeless people and to make an exception because the Premier of Quebec refused to do so. And the judge ruled in favor of people who are homeless to make that exception. But you have to think about this. If the courts were not available to this one, and usually courts are not available to those who are marginalized, it took people who are, usually sometimes work, again, like I said, out of the goodness of their hearts, who are not very well supported financially, to bring this court case. But if this court case wasn't brought, they will remain in this state where they have to avoid the curfew, which then leads to effects like that deepen their vulnerability. And there are many situations, if you go to that COVID-19 litigation database, there are many situations where these cases either could not be resolved in favor of the persons who were vulnerable, or where by the time it was resolved, the government policy had already caused people to die, and situations, of course, where litigation is not even pursued because there are no resources to pursue litigation. Another example comes from our dear province, and you all remember when Adriana Lagrange decided that she was done with masking, and she ordered school boards not to mandate masking anymore, and that no one should mask anymore in schools. She did this by making some bogus claims around how masking is stopping children from developing well. And she did this outside of the law. She actually had no legal authority to do this, as a court found eventually. And she did it by way of a letter, which I've posted here. And in doing so, the one question she didn't ask herself was, how about the immune compromised children who come to school every day? If you take off masking, what you're doing is basically dooming these kids to die. That's just the simple truth. If you remove masking from schools in the middle of a pandemic, this happened in the middle of a wave actually. If you do that, what you're essentially saying is you don't really care if immune compromised children die. As far as she's concerned, these are children who are already dead, and if this policy will achieve their death, so be it. So I think this is an example of necropolitics. And again, as you know, this case was action by Adriana Lagrange was challenged in court, and the court found that the action was improper. It was not properly legally authorized, and even though at the time the case was resolved, the policy was no longer needed, but the court found that it was still not good policy and was not legally supported. There's this case from, I'm not going to talk about this because in the interest of time, but there's this case from Germany's Constitutional Court as well, where they ruled that a policy whereby the government did not provide for protection of persons who were severely disabled in hospital settings in Germany was unconstitutional. So what had happened was, when the pandemic started, the government did not enact policies to try and protect those who were severely disabled from the effects of the pandemic. They basically just left them in these hospitals, and their death was pretty much assured if there were no protections in place to stop them from getting infected. And so they had gone to the Constitutional Court in Germany and said, can you please order the government to actually do something to protect us, since we're in a very vulnerable state? And the court made that order. So what you see in all of these examples is that it takes a court of law to actually force governments to do what's right. But various governments in many ways have either left these people without protections, or actually assumed that they're going to die anyway. So what's the point? Or they've made decisions that favor people who do not constitute the marginalized. And that's many of us. And I spent part of the paper talking about people like me who accept government policies that have these effects on the marginalized as maybe necessary, or even things that we shouldn't necessarily, protest against, or we can embrace. So I can think of things like when the government said, no more masking, and many of us embrace that. And, it's okay for us, but every day people keep dying in Alberta. Just last month, about 30 people died. And these are 30 people who, were already dead. And that no masking policy helped achieve their death. you are living dead. And for many of us, we can go around not being masked and not think about it. And I wonder about it. I wonder about policies that are accepted by many in the population as just, it's okay for us, but ultimately, for those who are marginalized, it just means that they're eventually going to face death. As I've argued, just to rush things up a little bit, people who are marginalized in our society are never in a normal state. Many of us can actually separate our lives into what was normal, so we'll call that the pre-pandemic, and we can say the pandemic is abnormal, but we're trying to return to what's normal. So many of us are actually making efforts to return to what's normal. We want to go out to restaurants to eat, want to go, want to live our lives free of masks. I've heard many people say this, don't want to be masking. I don't want to, I'm tired of the mask. I'm tired of the pandemic. I don't even want to think about it. Want to return to normal. But people who are marginalized, the elderly, people who are sick, people who are immunocompromised, people who are homeless, for them, their state of being is that it was not normal before. But what they're facing right now is an escalation because, when we had these policies in place that protect most of us, they would have benefited from that in some way. But by removing those policies and by returning to normal, the so-called normal, what we're doing is actually subjecting them to the effects of a pandemic that's still ongoing and which then deepens their vulnerability. So I think, the other thing I've heard is that there's going to be a post-pandemic state. But for them, that is a myth around that because we're never returning to a post-pandemic state where life is normal for people for whom it was never normal. Even when the pandemic does end, because we have not done anything to address the underlying reasons why people become marginalized. And because during the pandemic, we've actually ignored those things. So the things we learned from the pandemic, for example, that we need to have cleaner air, we've completely ignored that. We've not done anything to assure that. So even when we get to an eventual post-pandemic state, what we're doing is simply returning to a situation where that remains abnormal for people who are marginalized. So I think it's from abnormal to more abnormal, an escalation of abnormality for people who are in this kind of state. And I illustrate this by sort of looking at homelessness in Montreal, because we've talked about it already. This is some stats about homelessness in Montreal. But if you look at who's homeless, you get a sense that these are people who I will classify as marginalized and vulnerable. And if you look at the reasons why they are homeless, these are things that existed before the pandemic. These are things that were deepened during the pandemic, and things that we haven't addressed during the pandemic and which we'll return to after the pandemic. And so if we don't address these things and we keep them going, I don't really see any kind of return to normalcy for these people. It's always going to be abnormality. COVID-19, as I'm showing here, deepened many of these effects. And when we return to our so-called post-pandemic state, these effects are going to remain. Okay. I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to open it up for questions and answers. One last thing I'm going to talk about is that in the examples I've given of government policies that create this effect of making people who are classified as living dead achieve death, what you're going to find is that they're not actually enacted in ways that represent clear policy or clear legal rules or things that you can actually challenge. Instead, they come across as statements, letters that have no legal authority behind them or legal basis for them, statements that they make on the floor of legislature or in political context, things that they say as if it's offhand statements. And then, these are things that are difficult to challenge legally, actually, because when you're trying to challenge them, you can't actually, it's not as if it's written in a law where you can go, okay, look at this law, it's against the Constitution or it's against the Charter. So there are things that are covert in a lot of ways because they are expressions that do not tend to carry legal authority, but which actually embody the attitude and policies that it eventually enact. So if you think about Jason Kenney said that on the floor of legislature, he said in an offhand manner, people who are, 83, maybe they shouldn't still be living. We shouldn't really care about them. And that statement, you could go, okay, let me challenge that legally, but what are you exactly challenging? It's not, he's free to say things on the floor of legislature. It's not government policy. It's not as if it's in a directive. It's not as if it's in a law. But that statement represents, and I show this in the paper, represents the sum or a summary of all the policies that Jason Kenney enacted to deal with the pandemic. If you look at the actual policies, when we required masks, when we didn't require masks, when we required vaccination, when we required vaccination, all of that comes down to that statement that he made on the floor of legislature. He doesn't truly care about protecting the elderly and the immune compromised. So all the policies that his government enacted or didn't enact in the context of the pandemic flow from that statement. You can't challenge that statement, but that statement is an embodiment, really, of his nocturnal face, of his face in the dark. But when you shine a light on it, all you see are things that appear to be legit. But what is behind them is this nocturnal face that is deeply evil, that considers those who are elderly and immune compromised to be persons that we shouldn't care about. Here's another example from Donald Trump. And this is a quote from Donald Trump where he talks about the pandemic is not worth the bother because it affects the elderly, and elderly people will have problems. Donald Trump called for states to reopen schools because the virus affects virtually nobody. And so you see a common thread between Donald Trump, Jason Kenney, Adrienne Lagrange, where they are saying things that are not laws. So I call them non-law laws, and this comes from Mbembe. They are not laws, but they are the things that, statements that embody the spirit of the laws that these people actually enact, or the things that they fail to enact, which tend to impact people that they've dismissed as not worthy of protection, people that they consider to be already dead, and which they make as clear statements, and which may be outrageous to us, but which we can see are effectively how they've approached the pandemic and how they deal with the pandemic. It remains the case that today, we as a society still don't care about the elderly. They're still dying. We still don't care about protecting them. We don't actually have any policies now that protect the elderly. We just assume that they will take personal responsibility for their own protection. And many of us go about our daily lives having taken personal responsibility for how we go about how we manage pandemic. Some of us are very trusting in our ability to survive it because we're healthy or we have the means to be able to seek healthcare and seek remedial care when we get sick. But we forget that among those who are marginalized, who also seem to have poorer access to healthcare, that they're still living in this situation, and that they will achieve death because we don't have anything that protects them from it, and that's what it is. Okay, okay. I'm going to very quickly touch on this. I'm sorry. I did tell you guys that I will say I'm going to speak for 30 minutes and then go longer, but this is important. One thing I've heard people say is that even though the world is ordered this way, people in these marginalized groups are very resilient, and that they have ways of achieving resilience. People talk about how, among these communities, they find ways of relying on one another to achieve resilience. I really hate the term resilience because the only people who urge resilience are those who are actually privileged. I have known and I've worked with people who are marginalized, and they don't think of themselves as resilient. They think of themselves as suffering and as of waiting for their doom to be realized. But those of us who are trying to cope with a society where we see people who are suffering come up with things like hope and resilience as a way of resolving ourselves to a logic that allows us to be able to live with ourselves. That's the way I view resilience and hope. What we should do instead is call out the source of the suffering and not rely on tropes like resilience and hope, because it serves nobody but those who actually urge the resilience. That in a nutshell is the argument. Read the paper for more of it. And I'm going to stop talking now because I really want to talk. I really want to hear your thoughts on what I've offered so far. I didn't get to my solution, but maybe that's a talk for another day, because I do have something to say about practical justice, but I'll save it for either the Q&A or for another talk with the Dorsetter. But thank you for listening. And I look forward to your thoughts, comments, and questions.